So welcome to Twitter Wars, Alex Berenson and James Lawrence on the front lines of free speech. My name is Harrington Shaw, and I'm a 2024 UNC graduate and the managing director of the UNC Alumni Free Speech Alliance. So just on behalf of our organization, the UNC Federalist Society chapter, and the Student Free Speech Alliance, I want to thank you all for joining us. UNC AFSA's mission is to promote free speech, academic freedom, and viewpoint diversity at UNC. By hosting events like these, working with students and faculty on the ground, and advocating for free speech-focused policy reforms, we aim to foster a campus environment in which students feel free to exchange ideas, are unafraid to debate controversial topics in and out of class, and have the opportunity to hear a wide range of viewpoints throughout their higher education experience. We do have our work cut out for us. At universities across the country, free speech is in peril. Civic literacy is at a record low, self-censorship is at an all-time high, and students are afraid to exercise their expressive rights. Survey data from FIRE's 2025 college free speech rankings show that at UNC, 72% of students think that shouting down a speaker to prevent them from expressing their views is at least rarely acceptable. 33% say that using violence to stop someone from speaking on campus is at least rarely acceptable. And 58% of students say that they feel somewhat or very uncomfortable expressing their views on controversial topics in class. As free speech advocates, it's our job to ensure that students and faculty know their expressive rights and that they know that we have their backs. While the statistics are worrisome, I believe that brave students who dare to speak freely can provide the necessary spark on campus to bring others into the conversation and turn the tide against censorship. Our leaders in the Student Free Speech Alliance are helping us do just that. With that, please join me in welcoming Student Free Speech Alliance President Hunter Closty to come introduce tonight's guests.
Hello, welcome. Thank you for joining us tonight. First, I just want to say thank you to the entire Alumni Free Speech Alliance and Harrington specifically for helping organize this event. It is my privilege to introduce tonight's speakers, Alex Berenson and James Lawrence. Alex Berenson is a former New York Times reporter and author. After graduating from Yale with degrees in history and economics, he worked as a journalist covering issues from the Iraq War to the pharmaceutical industry. Early in the COVID-19 pandemic, Baronson raised skepticism regarding the media portrayal of the outbreak in addition to the government's response. His recent book on the COVID-19 pandemic, Pandemia, How Coronavirus Hysteria Took Over Our Government, Rights, and Lives, was published in November of 2021. Before Elon Musk acquired Twitter, Berenson's case, Berenson v. Twitter, revealed communications that exposed the Biden administration's attempts to pressure social media companies into banning accounts critical of COVID-19 policies and vaccine mandates. James Lawrence is a graduate of the UNC School of Law and partner at Envisage Law in Raleigh. He previously served as the Deputy General Counsel at the United States Department of Health and Human Services and as Chief Counsel of the Food and Drug Administration under President Trump. In addition to representing Berenson in a suit against Twitter, Lawrence has taken on the state of California's attempt to regulate speech on social media platforms on behalf of the Babylon Bee, content creator Tim Pool, and Minds Incorporated. Lawrence also represented social media influencer Doug Mackey, whose election interference conviction for satirical Twitter posts about the 2016 election set a precedent that an article in the Harvard Law Review described as dangerous for the First Amendment. So now, without further ado, Twitter Wars, Alex Berenson and James Lawrence on the front lines of free speech.
Thank you all for coming. This afternoon, James and I talked at the law school and sort of got deep into the weeds of Berenson v. Twitter and the new lawsuit, which is still being heard, my lawsuit against, or our lawsuit against the Biden administration, Berenson v. Biden, for their conduct related to conspiring to ban me from Twitter in 2021. And I'm happy to sort of talk about the lawsuits and take questions about them. But I want to pull back a little bit now and talk about the bigger issues at play here, because these are incredibly important companies, and what's happening with them is really defines free speech, not just in the United States, but worldwide right now. So a company like Twitter provided me in 2020 and provides everyone with a free megaphone to the world. And there's hundreds of millions of people on Twitter worldwide using it actively. And a lot of those people are journalists or sort of otherwise involved in their communities. And again, this is not just in the United States, it's in every country. And for somebody who is not working in a newspaper, and I did work at the New York Times from 1999 through 2010, or doesn't have a cable channel, or doesn't have another platform, Twitter, or to a lesser extent Facebook, YouTube, or even TikTok provide these outlets that are free where your voice can be heard and sometimes be heard incredibly widely. And so for countries and companies that are used to essentially controlling the flow of information, the platforms and the people on them are to some extent a threat. And the platforms don't quite know what to do with this power, I think, and we don't quite know how to regulate them at this point or how to define them. And so the last few years have been a muddle and a mess and continue to be. There's sort of no sign that this is stopping anytime soon. In my ideal world, basically, Twitter would be open to all at all times. And if you said terrible things, if you promoted Nazi propaganda or whatever it is, you would be shouted down. And if you weren't shouted down, at the very least, people would know who you were, or what your avatar was, and who was listening to you. So to me, in general, I'm pretty close to a free speech absolutist. Now, obviously, even in my conception of free speech, there have to be some limits. I mean, something like child pornography is not protected speech, and a conspiracy to burn down somebody's house is not protected speech. There are times when speech is criminal. Right? But aside from those moments, and there are times when speech is harassing, I mean, in very limited instances. But the truth is the United States has gotten very good over the last 200 plus years at figuring out what those instances are and where to draw the lines. And just because we're on a new platform doesn't mean that the lines go away. And Twitter, again, in particular, was conceived as a place for free speech. There's a famous line, I think it's from 2014, where an English executive at Twitter said, "We are the free speech wing of the free speech party." And that's what Twitter was and wanted to be. And in 2016, Donald Trump, was elected president of the United States. Or in 2016, Donald Trump was elected president of the United States. And that shocked a lot of the legacy media. It shocked academia. It led to a lot of questions, I think, about how all these powerful institutions had failed to prevent that from happening, because they were clearly acting in ways to try to stop that from happening. And so the social media platforms were sort of target one. All these people speaking to each other. And the pressure on them increased dramatically between 2016 and 2020. It increased again on January 6, 2021, when they were viewed as having been used to foment the riot at the Capitol. COVID and the efforts to sort of speak in lockstep by public health authorities and governments also increased the pressure on them. And for the most part, they buckled. Even Twitter buckled and started to, they acted against me, they acted against other people. Elon came in and bought Twitter, but even Elon is not immune to the pressure that governments worldwide are putting on social media platforms. So we need to decide, I think it's really a democratic decision for all of us, what the platforms are and how, whether or not access to them is going to be something close to a right, and whether they're going to be common carriers, basically. In other words, when you make a phone call, AT&T or Verizon does not have the right to, check the content of your call before it puts it through. And again, there are limited exceptions to that, right? I mean, there can be a warrant where, where law enforcement has gotten the rights to listen to that call. But for the most part, your words are yours alone. And to me, the large platforms essentially should be viewed as common carriers first. Now, they don't want that. It is not in their interest to be, to have to carry all speech on sort of an as trafficked basis. They want to promote things that they think are going to be interesting to people and are going to get their attention, and at the same time are not overly, nauseating to most people. So they want control over their traffic, and commercially, and they've been very, very successful as companies using that control, whether that's Meta and Facebook, whether that's TikTok. So we have to decide how much control we're willing to give them and what their immunity and legal status is going to be for the speech that they promote versus the speech that they simply carry and don't promote. It gets very, very complicated because they do have these algorithms, which essentially are just ways to promote various, whether it's posts or videos, and downvote, down promote other videos or posts that they don't like as much. But right now, we've given them incredible legal standing, immunity, essentially. They have all the freedom of common carriers in that they are not held liable for anything that they carry, but they have all the protection of a traditional newspaper publisher in that they are allowed to curate and carry whatever they like. And they've sort of lucked into this thanks to a federal law that's commonly known as Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. And from my point of view, they're actually something closer to a distributor, which is yet another sort of legal entity. There's publishers, distributors, and common carriers when you're talking about media companies. And so what they're doing for me is not vetting my speech, but allowing me to broadcast it to a larger audience. They're distributing it. So when we think about what we want these companies to be, and what protections we want to give them, I think those two questions are closely intertwined. And the truth is, nobody's really thought about this very much. I mean, people have thought about it, but from sort of a congressional point of view, and even from a Supreme Court point of view, these questions have been unanswered, and the companies basically, they like their position right now because everybody likes immunity. At the same time, they're under tremendous political pressure from people who are aware of how important they are and how much value Section 230 provides them. And so it's an uncomfortable position for everybody, and until we have a real conversation about the power of these companies and how we're going to regulate them, and even how we're going to define them, I think it's going to continue to be messy.
I agree with all that, and I would add the Supreme Court last term in cases that came out of the state of Texas and the state of Florida, the net choice cases, looked at this issue because Texas, I'm more familiar with the Texas law than I am with the Florida law, but Texas was trying to, at the state level, regulate some of these platforms as common carriers. And I believe that was explicitly in one of the provisions of the Texas law. The Supreme Court, in a decision, I think it was on the last day of the term, reversed the 5th and the 11th circuits. The 11th circuit had sided with the companies, the 5th circuit had sided with the state of Texas. But they reversed and remanded to the 11th and the 5th circuits to do more analysis. Justice Kagan wrote the majority opinion in that case, and if you read it, it does start, the court does start to grapple with some of the questions that Alex is raising right now. But there's a lot of play in the joints in the decision. So one of the hypotheticals that Justice Kagan raised in her majority opinion is, under the Texas law, the platforms could be required, at least in theory, to broadcast Nazi propaganda, even if it goes against their own stated policies. And the point she and the majority were raising is that raises First Amendment concerns that are cognizable for the platforms themselves because they have at some level some interest. They might not be publishers in the sense that a traditional newspaper would be. They might not be telephone companies. They're somewhere on a spectrum, and the court suggested that they have at some level cognizable First Amendment rights that are somewhere between, again, common carriers and publishers and newspapers. It's an interesting question to raise in the context of your case, though, because when we were litigating the Berenson versus Twitter case in the first instance, one of Twitter's defenses was, and their attorney at the hearing on the motion to dismiss in late April of 2022 made the argument right out of the gate. We're not required, Twitter is not required under long-standing precedent to broadcast Alex Berenson's speech about COVID-19. Now, here's the rub, here's the issue. As Alex noted, Twitter calls itself the free speech wing of the free speech party at various points in time. Jack Dorsey, who we'll talk about a little bit more maybe in the discussion, went before Congress and talked about Twitter being a global public square, that the public sees it as a public square. I believe that's true. Now, if you look at what was at issue in Alex's case, he was deplatformed from Twitter in August of 2021 on the basis, as the company stated publicly that he had repeatedly violated the platform's rules on COVID-19 misinformation. Now, if you're tracking with me so far, let's think about the First Amendment implications of what we were litigating in front of Twitter back in 2022. If you have a speech code, and Twitter did have a speech code on COVID-19, and they have a number of other policies. So does Facebook, so does YouTube, so do all the other major platforms. If those rules are enforced against a user like Alex, and the content at issue does not actually violate those rules, and in Alex's case, we maintain that they didn't, and we have found out that even high-ranking executives at Twitter agreed with that assessment. What's the First Amendment problem? There is no First Amendment problem for that kind of issue, for the kind of problem that Alex's case raised back in 2022. If it doesn't violate your own standards and your own policies, then how is it a First Amendment violation to apply those policies to your speech code? And I think as the courts grapple with these issues going forward, there's a lot of play in the joints in what the Supreme Court did back in June in the Florida and Texas cases, and I think that's going to be worked out below. So there are a lot of unanswered questions, even if I think a lot of advocates of big tech's position on these issues declared victory back in June.
So I think people sometimes don't really understand how much power 230 gives the company. So let me just give you a few examples. If you're banned from Twitter or Facebook, you lose access to your account. Everybody loses access to your account. If you've had your life on there for 10 years, it's just gone. No one can see it. It's still in some server somewhere, but you can't see it either. James brought a case I guess it was last year, against a company called Reddit. Reddit had taken, so Reddit is, it's essentially a network of bulletin boards, and people spend lots of time curating these bulletin boards, which can be on anything from, UNC basketball to politics to knitting to, there's I don't know the number, but there are certainly hundreds of thousands of they're called subreddits. And Reddit's terms say that essentially it can kick you off as a moderator of a subreddit and essentially take control of that subreddit and give it to somebody else at any time, as it did with your client. The companies take the position that they could exclude, let's say, all black people or all Jews or all women if they chose to, that 230 gives them that power. In one case, Google, via YouTube, took money that someone had made, I guess it was, monetizing ads against content. They decided they didn't like the content. They kept the money. And the person sued and said, look, at the very least, you have to give me what I earned. And they said, under our terms, once we cancel your account, we don't. And the courts looked at 230, and they looked at the protection it gave Google, and they said, Google is right, and they tossed that lawsuit. The immunity here is close to absolute, and it is incredibly powerful. And so, again, I'm really unique in that I was able to sue my way back onto the platform. And the reason I was able to sue my way back on was because I had two things going for me. One was I had personal assurances from an executive at Twitter in 2020 who was encouraging me to speak about lockdowns, probably at the encouragement of Jack Dorsey, the CEO himself. That was certainly my impression at the time, and nothing that's come out since then has led me to believe otherwise. And secondly, what I said really didn't violate Twitter's policies. And when you look at the tweets that they called violative, they weren't really violative. So even with that, I was not able to get the sort of broad constitutional claims through a motion to dismiss. I got narrower claims about Twitter's violating its own contract against me through Twitter's motion to dismiss, which was powerful enough that Twitter then was forced to settle with me and put me back on, but did not prove the bigger point, did not really change the landscape broadly constitutionally. And with Berenson v. Biden, so one of the things that happened, or has happened over the last 2+ years since we settled with Twitter, is documents have come out of Twitter, and they've come out in sort of a variety of ways. With old Twitter, before Elon bought it and turned it into X, old Twitter promised to give me certain documents as part of settling with me, essentially documents related to White House and other pressure that it had faced to ban my account. And those documents showed that the White House in 2021, as the pressure to vaccinate was rising, did explicitly ask Twitter to ban me. And then in the first round of the Twitter files, I was able to see some documents. I was out in San Francisco. This was when there was a sort of chaotic process happening where Elon was, literally inviting journalists in to look at the files and sort of screenshot stuff. It was a strange process, but I wound up seeing some documents that have proven useful in the lawsuit. And then more recently, we have gotten more documents from X in a much more comprehensive way, which actually still don't include some of the earlier stuff we saw. So even with all of that, even with explicit help from Elon Musk, even with a settlement that is unique in the annals of sort of the fighting with these companies over free speech, it is, I'm gonna have the fight of my life, James and I, we're gonna have the fight of our lives to get Berenson v. Biden past the motion to dismiss and really see what was happening in terms of the pressure that the White House and Pfizer as well were putting on Twitter to ban me in 2021. Now, we think we have a really good case. We think we're going to win, or and certainly we're going to survive the motion to dismiss, which will allow us to conduct discovery and interview some of these people and really get them under oath. But what I'm saying is I have a uniquely strong case, it seems not just to me, but to other people who are sort of aware of the other cases. And I've had unique help. And it is still very, very, very hard to pierce the legal shield to show that these companies are acting in concert with the government in specific ways. And so we've talked about there's two sides to the censorship coin, right? The first side is, should the companies be forced to carry everything? Okay, that is complicated. It is, because again, are they common carriers? Are they curating? Do they want to be in the position of having to post, again, Nazi propaganda or whatever it may be when they're trying to sell ads against that, and they fear their brand may be tarnished? Okay, that's a very complicated question. My lawsuit is actually about a much simpler question, which is, how far can the government go to push private companies to ban speech, especially when the government and conspire, by the way, with a private company, with Pfizer, in doing this. And the federal government has extraordinary power over the companies because of 230, because 230 is so important and it has power, just in other ways, right? It helps them negotiate their legal battles with other countries. I mean, the federal government is a powerful force that anybody in corporate America does not want to cross if they don't have to. So the federal government is powerful, but it's uniquely powerful because of the unique protection that 230 offers these companies. And how far should government agencies or the White House push companies to ban speech? And I think it's pretty clear that in my case, they went too far, okay? In the broader question of, should they say, hey, we don't like anti-vaccine content? Look, if they want to broadly say that, they have a First Amendment right to say that. I don't think that they should be targeting posts, individual posts. I don't think they should be targeting individual users, and I don't think that they should be threatening the companies with the loss of Section 230 protection or other specific regulatory actions for carrying specific speech. And even broad categories of speech, anti-vax speech, as they called it. To me, it was smart vaccine skepticism that the last 3 years have broadly proven largely correct, but we can argue about that. It doesn't actually matter whether I was right or wrong. As an American on a platform that's was based in California, is now based in Texas, I should have had the right to say that stuff. And frankly, I should have had the right. Really, it's pretty simple. And the White House, which is the most powerful institution in the world, and the CDC, which had $1 billion marketing budget, and the help of every bit of legacy media in the United States, if they can't deal with me, then it's a bigger problem with the vaccines. So I think there is this very complicated question about must carry, may carry, what are the companies, but there's a simpler issue for me with Berenson v. Biden, which is don't censor me. I'm just one guy trying to write stuff and get facts out there. And if you don't like the facts or you think I'm wrong, go ahead and kick at me on Twitter or off. But don't try to get the platform to ban me, which is what they did. And they spent months doing it, and they finally succeeded. And I'll just say one more thing about this specifically, which is something that people really don't know. And to me is in some ways the most incredible part of all of this. So the White House, I say the White House, but there's really a couple of people inside the White House. Most notably a guy named Andy Slavitt, who I had jousted with on Twitter in 2020 as he was calling for things like essentially halting food production to stop COVID. I'm not exaggerating. You can go back and find Slavitt's tweets from the summer of 2020. He was a true COVID panicker. Okay, so he comes into the White House, and the White House believes that the vaccines are going to end the epidemic, and they got to get everybody vaccinated. And so he, as early as April, possibly March, is pushing Twitter to kick me off. And Twitter initially will not, this takes a few months for them to win this fight and get Twitter to kick me off. But one of Andy Slavitt's friends is a guy named Scott Gottlieb. Scott Gottlieb was the FDA commissioner early and in the middle of Donald Trump's administration, and then left, and literally 3 months to the day after he left the FDA, joined the board of Pfizer, where he's a senior director. He makes $400,000 a year for 4 board meetings. It's nice work if you can get it. But Scott Gottlieb has proven very, very valuable to Pfizer, because in 2020 and 2021, he was on TV constantly talking about how important the vaccines were and how great they were in encouraging everybody to get vaccinated. And at the same time, which is fine, that's his First Amendment right. At the same time, Andy Slavitt and Scott Gottlieb were secretly colluding and conspiring to get Twitter to ban me. So a senior director at Pfizer, a company that made $100 billion selling mRNA vaccines, tried to curtail my access to the only place I could really speak and be heard worldwide. And again, try to think about, as James, the analogy James used earlier today was, let's say it had been 2003 and, you know, I was yapping about, you know, how terrible the Iraq War was and we shouldn't go in, whatever I was saying. By the way, this was, you know, there was no Twitter at that time, and I was working for the New York Times at that time. So, you know, this is just obviously a hypothetical. And let's say that the Bush administration had tried to get me banned, and then somebody inside the administration had reached out to a friend at Boeing or Lockheed Martin, and that person had leaned on Twitter to get me banned. That would be a national scandal, and rightly so. But because this is about vaccines, and because the media was pushing the vaccines as intently as anybody else in 2021, I can't even get a story written about this. I mean, no one will cover this. So it is, you know, again, the fact that the White House was involved in pushing a private company to push me off and shut me up is incredible, but the fact that Pfizer was involved is more incredible, and the fact that the media will not cover it is, you know, sort of 3 strikes.
And you got 5 from
And I got 5 from Twitter.
Right? But to your point, and we were talking about this earlier, the importance of these platforms, and I have a very small, I have a small following on Twitter, but just to, or X, but just to put it into perspective, I mean, he was tweeting information back in 2020, and I can say this because he was one of the only voices out there that was actually asking questions. And very early on in the pandemic, I started as a lawyer to represent individuals, businesses who were working and pushing back against the Cooper administration's lockdown orders here in North Carolina. I mean, let's remember, I mean, you could go get an abortion in North Carolina, you could go to a liquor store, but you couldn't go to church on Easter in Roy Cooper's North Carolina. That happened here. And I got involved pushing back on that regime, and Alex was one of the only people out there that was asking questions and putting research together, and I know I relied on a lot of the things that he was finding and bringing to bear for the public. And X, or Twitter at the time, was that outlet. And we plugged this in the complaint, but going back, the first tweet I think that you made that really went viral was your critique of Dr. Ferguson in the United Kingdom, and it got picked up ultimately by Elon and by Donald Trump Jr., I think you were mentioning earlier. And we pled this in the complaint, but the Imperial College was not happy with you back in March of 2020. And yet Twitter, even old Twitter, pushed back and allowed you to continue to have a platform. But the importance of these outlets cannot be overstated, and the democratizing effect of a single person like Alex being able to question the prevailing narrative. An ordinary person like me from Raleigh, North Carolina, being able to engage recently with Katie Couric, the former CBS news anchor who was publishing something about, I think, her delight in the fact that George W. Bush's Attorney General Alberto Gonzales was going to endorse the Harris campaign, or had endorsed the Harris campaign. It really levels the playing field, it democratizes information, and it's not surprising that powerful interests don't like that.
Yes, and clearly this fight is ongoing. I mean, just in the last few weeks, the CEO or founder of a company called Telegram, which is a messaging service that, you know, is more widely used outside the U.S., although it's used in the U.S. too, was arrested in France and accused with essentially promoting child pornography and other illegal acts on Telegram. And Telegram can be problematic for sure. There's the companies do need to moderate illegal content. I mean, I don't think that anybody would disagree with that. And states have an interest in that. They have an interest in sort of trying to police the dark web, and whether that's the literal dark web or whether it's apps that are being used by large numbers of people in sort of semi-secret ways. the people who run those apps have some responsibility to manage illegal content. What I was saying at lunch or at the law school event is you can sort of see what happened, which is these companies they're called trust and safety departments, and they again were initially designed really to help law enforcement knock down content that was clearly illegal. And so you went from illegal to, well, this is foreign propaganda, and so trying to hit at it doesn't really affect the rights of U.S. citizens. And then it was, well, these U.S. citizens are promoting this foreign propaganda. And then it was, well, people are lying. We can't have lying on Twitter. Like, I mean, if there were no lying on Twitter, it would not be a very interesting place. But I'm joking, defendants in Berenson v. Biden, I don't lie. Then it was, well, there's misinformation. And, the definition of misinformation is sometimes, it varies depending on who's saying it, but it's sort of broadly, facts that you think are true that I don't think are true, okay? So you know what, it's in the government, certainly in the United States, does not have the right to get involved in the misinformation business, okay? And then there's malinformation, which is a term most people, even people who are sort of sophisticated about this stuff, often have not heard. Malinformation is information that is true that I just don't want you to hear, okay? So in the summer of 2021, before the vaccines were failing, and then they sort of failed all at once over the summer. They just everybody's antibodies went down, and Delta came in, and all of a sudden these were not a miracle anymore. Before that, in the spring, when they were working, what I was writing about was these sort of extreme cases of myocarditis, and they were rare, but they were real. Young people, a handful of young people, but to the person who it's happening to, or the family that it's happened to, it doesn't matter that it's a rare condition. It's still a side effect of a vaccine, and somebody who's at very, very low risk from COVID, we're getting sick. Okay, and I was writing about that, and to Andy Slavitt and Pfizer, that was a problem. That was malinformation. Nobody was disputing that this was happening. They just didn't want it to be written about in a way that was going to discourage people from getting vaccinated. So if you were going to write about it, you had to talk at the very top of the story about how rare it was and how great the vaccines were, and only then could you discuss the fact that somebody had a heart attack or died, or had been put in the ICU after getting this vaccine for a disease that was really zero risk to an 18-year-old healthy man or woman. So that's malinformation. Okay, so you start with stuff that's criminal, and you end up trying to police stuff that's just factual information that you don't like. Okay, and in the United States, we shouldn't do that. We shouldn't stop misinformation. We should let the courts deal with lies and slander if it comes to that. And if you want to talk about foreign propaganda, I mean, the best evidence and frankly common sense suggests that a few Russian idiots in St. Petersburg did not win Donald Trump the 2016 presidential election. The fact that Hillary Clinton is like the most hateable person in the world is what won Donald Trump the 2016 presidential election. But by the way, I'm old enough to remember, as are all of you, when money was the great sin in politics. Because before 2016, the Republicans outraised the Democrats. So every time they would do that, there would be articles written about how terrible money was and what a corrupting force it was in politics. Well, now the Democrats hugely outraise the Republicans, and so money is a sign of enthusiasm in politics. I mean, this is really what happens. So the media needed to find somebody else to blame, and they blamed, the internet farm in St. Petersburg for Donald Trump's election. And away we went. And so what I think also, again, we're in the United States. We have good protections in general for free speech, even though they've been worn away a little bit. We don't have a truly repressive authoritarian regime. But these companies, as important as they are in the United States, they are arguably even more important in places where free speech And free speech is not a real human right. It's not a real value, and where the regimes are more repressive. And so one of the things that at Twitter certainly they were conscious of, and so they were when they would talk about, oh, should we let people post anonymously? People say, oh, well, you can't let people post anonymously. It's it encourages trolling. It's like, well, you know what? In Tunisia, where you're trying to organize an Arab Spring, if you don't post anonymously, you get thrown in jail and never let out. Okay, in a place where homosexuality is punishable by death, a gay kid trying to find friends online, in a strict Muslim country is risking his life. So maybe we should let him post anonymously. So the companies, were aware of this, and I think some people, some executives at the company still are aware of this. They're aware that letting the government into their business too much is a big mistake. Okay, and besides the fact that in the United States it's unconstitutional, it's a big mistake. But they came under such pressure beginning in 2016 when Donald Trump was elected, worsening during COVID, worsening after the January 6th riots, that they buckled. And again, one of the most interesting things that has come out in the documents that we found is that the top two executives at Twitter didn't want me banned. That essentially the ban was forced through essentially in the middle of the night on a Saturday night by a lobbyist in the Twitter's Washington office who was directly interfacing with the White House, which I'm going to love to see how they try to explain this away when they respond to our amended complaint in a week or two. But it is pretty amazing that the people in the companies, and this was true of Facebook too, true of Meta too, they didn't like the pressure they were facing. They did want to stand up for free speech, but they are commercial enterprises, and 230 is very important to them, and good relationships with the federal government are very important to them, and ultimately they buckled. And so, hopefully, at least in the United States, the pendulum has swung as far as it's going to swing in terms of government pressure. We'll see, but you know what? In Brazil, Elon Musk, who bought X or bought Twitter and renamed it X and said it was going to be the free speech platform, backed down because Brazil essentially had shut X's operations in Brazil, and he decided he couldn't let that happen, so he knuckled under. These are powerful institutions, but ultimately governments, repressive governments, whether it's China or Russia or it's not the whole government of Brazil with this judge in Brazil, can force them to shut. They don't have armies. They can't make governments let them operate. And so it's really important that this country, which has stood for free speech since the Bill of Rights was passed, continues to stand for free speech and doesn't pressure the companies. And yes, we can then have the flip side, the more complicated argument of, do they have to carry stuff because they are so important? But I think, again, we can go back and say they shouldn't, we shouldn't, government agencies shouldn't, the White House shouldn't be pushing the companies not to carry speech. It sets a terrible precedent for the rest of the world.
And some positive developments in this space. Just recently, and Alex mentioned X. X brought a lawsuit against the state of California, and in the open, Hunter mentioned some of the work that our firm did out in California on behalf of some plaintiffs who sued California over a law called AB 587. And so the way this statutory scheme worked is it requires the covered platforms, and that would include X, Meta, Facebook, and whatnot, to provide semi-annual reporting to the Attorney General's office on actions that they've taken to censor and moderate speech across 8 different categories of speech, including foreign propaganda, misinformation, disinformation, hate speech was a listed category. We brought a lawsuit again on behalf of some plaintiffs out in California, calling this out for what it was, which is an attempt by California, which has, by economic output, one of the largest economies in the world, but an attempt by the state of California to impose its regulatory agenda on these companies that are there and homegrown to affect censorship on my clients in that case. And the district court, in our case, dismissed the case on standing grounds, that we're not directly regulated by this, and that because we're not directly regulated, we didn't have standing to sue and challenge it. To X's credit, X, who is directly regulated, brought a lawsuit, and just recently at the Ninth Circuit won on the merits, and case has been remanded for the entry of a preliminary injunction against the state of California related to these reporting requirements. And in the litigation, it's interesting. In the litigation, California was pretty open about its desire to use these quote-unquote transparency measures to really show who the good corporate citizens are and who the bad actors are. And they didn't hide that was their intention. They said that was a legitimate government interest, that consumers had the right to know who were the bad boys and who were the good boys.
You know, I think this idea that you should try to curtail what people say, you know, on a personal note, especially in 2020 and 2021, I can't tell you how many emails I would get, because people, especially in blue states, or, you know, in this state obviously have pretty strict restrictions too, they'd say, you know, I thought I was crazy. I thought I was the only one who didn't understand what was going on, and didn't understand why, you know, like I'm a 30-year-old in good shape, like why I couldn't go to the gym, or why, you know, I couldn't go to church, or I couldn't hang out with my friends. What was happening? And they said, you know, that people would email me and say, I saw your Twitter feed, and it made me realize, like, I wasn't the only one who had these questions. And I mean, I truly believe that when you take away somebody's right to speak, either with brute force, or by, you know, making it so unpleasant for them, you know, discouraging them, telling them that their speech is so wrong that they're a disgusting person merely for saying it, it's really psychologically damaging, okay? Because either the person has to decide that, you know what, I am a bad person and I just have wrong think, or they have to say, you know what, like I believe what I believe, but I'm gonna just keep it to myself, right? I'm essentially gonna gaslight myself. Even though I believe this is true, I know I'm not allowed to say it. And there's a reason why totalitarian regimes, you know, try to suppress speech. And so I am glad that all of you, you know, have, understand the value of this. And one of the other strange things to me is, like, the left used to understand this, okay? They did, and it was a classically, you know, it's a classically liberal value, but it was, you know, in a liberal versus conservative way, that speech is something that the weak need to stand up to the strong. And so, you know, it's been a tremendous disappointment to me, again, that no one will write about this stuff, you know, about my lawsuit, and that when the New York Times, and it is not an exaggeration, in 2004, I was working for the New York Times, and I was in Iraq, and I almost got killed, okay? You know, you don't need to know any of the details, but I almost got killed, okay? And that's how much I cared about the New York Times, and how much I loved being a reporter there, and how important I thought the mission was. And I have no regrets as to what happened, okay? You're a war correspondent, shit happens. But to see that the New York Times would say last year something to the extent of, there are times when the First Amendment seems to be an anti-democratic value. I mean, that's not the exact language they use. I should find it before I quote it, because I want to get it right. But essentially, it was, well, there are times when maybe, you know, speech needs to be suppressed. I mean, they're so lost. If that they would write that. And they're so acting against their own interests, their long-term interests, which have to be to promote debate and speech and journalism, and not undercut it and say, oh, well, there are times when it's a bad idea to let people talk about vaccine dangers or COVID or whatever the issue that the left doesn't want to talk about may be. And before we filed Berenson v. Biden, I emailed, James is on an email. We emailed the director of the Knight First Amendment Institute at Columbia, and said, hey, we're filing this, and we'd love for you guys to stand with us here. You stood for free speech when Donald Trump tried to block people from following his private account on Twitter. And you were right. He was the president of the United States at that time. He shouldn't be banning people from following him or posting, even if they're really annoying. That's a public account because he's the president of the United States. And that's a case that we mentioned in the lawsuit as an important precedent. Well, this guy basically didn't even respond. Okay, and the day that I knew that things had really gotten weird and the left had really lost the plot on this was in 2021, in September 2021, when the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, came out essentially in favor of vaccine mandates. Okay? It's the American Civil Liberties Union. So it is upsetting to me as somebody who, I grew up, as a Democrat. I'm a political independent now, but I'm not really a Republican. But the Democrats have lost the plot, and it's very upsetting to me to see that. So, I do wish that people on the left would remember that the pendulum is going to swing one day, and they'll wish they had protection.
Your comment about free speech being a protection for the ability of the weak to speak truth to power reminded me of a quote from Dune, and I might butcher it, but I think it does characterize the mentality of the current political left, and you've already hinted at some of the political realignments that are happening in our country. I mean, we've got, Dick Cheney endorsing the current vice president for president. We've got Robert F. Kennedy Jr. endorsing Donald Trump. So I do think there are realignments happening, and I find myself as somebody who grew up in the conservative movement, finding much more common cause with people like Glenn Greenwald and others than I have with establishment conservatives. But the quote from Dune is something along the lines of, and I think this encapsulates the mentality of the current political left, when I am weak, I ask for freedom because that is according to your principles. When I am strong, I take away your freedom because that is according to my principles. So free speech is a powerful tool for the underdog. Jeff Deist, who runs the Mises Institute, said that. I reposted it on X earlier today. And right now, I think progressives and the left control most of, if not all, of the major institutions in America. So it makes sense from a preservation standpoint that they would not be in favor of free speech as the incumbent and the favorite. But that's just my 2 cents.
Should we get Mr. Husband?
Thank you both so much. Good evening, my name is Sunhee Frecker, and I'm the Vice President of the Student Free Speech Alliance here on UNC's campus. We are now going to enter the Q&A portion of tonight. As part of the question and answer session, we will welcome a very special guest, Walter Hussman, to join us. Walter Hussman is a UNC alumnus, prominent newspaper publisher, and media executive known for his commitment to journalistic integrity and principled reporting. In 2019, he made a landmark donation to UNC's journalism school, prompting Carolina to rename it in his honor. His gift was accompanied by a statement of values emphasizing fairness, accuracy, impartiality, and a clear separation between news and opinion. Hussman's vision for the school is rooted in the belief that journalism serves as a public trust, and his aim is to equip future journalists with the ethical foundation necessary to uphold these principles. Hussman's legacy at UNC is marked by his effort to instill the core values of journalism in a new generation of media professionals while promoting the free exchange of ideas as essential to democracy and an informed citizenry. Of course, as proponents of free speech, we encourage all perspectives and viewpoints to participate. Please pass your index cards to the aisle to be collected. Thank you so much.
You know, I'll just say one of the things as Mr. Hussman's coming up is that, you know, I'm sad tonight that, you know, this is a good crowd, but I wish there were more, you know, students here, right? Because I feel like people on the left and younger people don't really, in their bones, get free speech. And you can see it in surveys. You can see, you know, particularly, you know, liberals under 30, but really conservatives to a lesser extent, don't, you know, they think, oh, you know, speech can be harmful and, you know, speech needs to be regulated almost as a weapon sometimes. And, you know, I guess I'm from the generation that, you know, sticks and stones will break my bones, right? But it is sad that, and it does make me worry where we'll be in another 10 or 20 years if people don't, you know, get this for themselves.
I certainly enjoyed that discussion, and we need more advocates for free speech in this country, and really appreciate Alex and his attorney for stepping up on this. Kind of a novel idea. I think one of my favorite expressions of quotes on free speech was from Frederick Douglass in 1860, and he said, you know, to restrain free speech is a double wrong. It wrongs the speaker and it wrongs the listener. So there's great free speech advocates who want to be speakers, but what about free speech advocates who want to be listeners? Is there any kind of organization like that?
It's an interesting question. In the Murphy v. Missouri case, there was an argument made, and by the way, that dealt with social media censorship. It was a case that was brought by a number of plaintiffs, including Dr. Bhattacharya at Stanford and others. And they made an argument, a legal argument, that there's a First Amendment right to listen. The court was not very receptive to that theory for standing purposes, but I'm not aware of any such organization that promotes those interests. Maybe Alex knows.
I don't.
I think you had a good point. I wanted to just ask one other personal question from Alex. So, you know, basically, we publish small town newspapers and 2 regional newspapers, and we get our information from the wire services, AP, and the New York Times, Washington Post are 2 wire services, also Bloomberg. So we have a Washington correspondent, but we have 1. We can't afford more than that. So it's we really depend on the wire services to get information to our readers. Alex, your suit versus Biden, can you tell us kind of what coverage the AP and the New York Times, Washington Post has given?
Oh, no, none. I mean, none. And I said to James, I mean, when I initially filed the initial suit against Twitter, there was some coverage from sort of snarky publications on the left about how dumb it was and how I was going to get tossed out. And you know, and how I might even face, you know, penalties for filing this stupid lawsuit. And of course, you know, in April 2022, the judge allowed it to move forward, which was a, you know, a huge victory for us. And James said, "Oh, there's going to be a lot written about this." James was naive about the press. I said, "No, I don't think so." And then, you know, in July 2022, we settled, and they put me back on, and they acknowledged that they'd been wrong. I mean, this is, you know, this is like, to get one of these companies, to get any public, you know, major company to admit error and reverse course. James said, "Well, there's definitely going to be some stuff written now." I said, "You'll see, James," and there was not. And then the next month, we got these documents showing that the White House had actually pushed for this. And by this point, James was cynical, and I said actually, "Well, maybe this will get somebody's attention." He said, "No way," and he was right. So you know, the new complaint, you know, is 95 pages long. It's too long, frankly. It shouldn't be that long, but we had to put in all the new information, and you don't take out the older information, so it's got to be a real beast of a complaint. And what I, you know, when you file these lawsuits, when you don't have proof of something and you think it's true, oftentimes the sort of the legal artful term for this is upon information and belief. Okay, and it's a way to sort of get around the fact that you don't have evidence to support your claim at that moment. We have very, very few instances of upon information and belief in our 95-page amended complaint. We have a lot of evidence, a unique trove of evidence, and it is stunning to me that nobody will write about this. Even from the point of view, let me just, you know, as a business story, okay, there's no question that if you're the general counsel of Google or, you know, Meta, the day after also issued this ruling, the judge in 2022, there's no question there would have been an email sent out from those companies to their employees saying, "Don't make personal assurances to users because it can be used against us." Okay, that's a good story. The story of the litigation is just a good business and news story. But again, because, and to say nothing again about the fact that Pfizer was involved in all of this, but because they don't like me, and because it's embarrassing to them that I turned out not to be, you know, a nut job, it's actually embarrassing to them. I mean, the Times, I'm sure, wishes I had never worked there. They will not cover it, and it's a weird form of gaslighting. And so, you know, there may be a major sort of independent journalist who's going to write about this in the next couple of weeks, and hopefully that will get picked up, and hopefully that will, you know, maybe spur a story or two, but I wouldn't count on it. I mean, we've discussed this. You know, if I win a huge judgment against, you know, Pfizer and the Biden administration, you know, or its successors, would that get attention? If the Supreme Court decides it has to rule on my case, would that get attention? Or even then, would the cone of silence continue? I don't know the answer to that.
If there's news development, will you email me on it? I'll try to get it in our papers. So, a question from the audience here. Would you discuss the pros and cons of Elon Musk's record on free speech?
Yeah, I think that's actually a very fair question. Yeah, I think Elon has good instincts. I think sometimes he hasn't always lived up to his, you know, highest principles. You know, and he also, it's difficult, right? Because he, I'm sorry, I don't want there to be, I feel like there's a lot of feedback right now. I don't know what to do about it, but, you know, he's got commercial interests all over the world, right? He's a very, very powerful guy who runs company, you know, who runs an amazing electric car company, who runs a space, you know, the world's largest private space exploration company, who, you know, has commercial satellites. He does business worldwide, and so businesses or countries, have a lot of leverage over him. And so I do think Elon, you know, in his heart, or in his mind, is a free speech advocate, and generally thinks more speech is better than less. I think there have been moments when he hasn't necessarily followed. There have been moments when he's made mistakes about that, but overall, it is much better that he owns X than where X was, or Twitter was before he bought it. And what he's done with the Twitter file and what he's done with our lawsuit is amazing, and he deserves credit for that. And if we get past the motion to dismiss, as we hope and expect we will, the documents that X has provided to us in the last few months are crucial to that. So am I glad that he bought X? I absolutely am. Do I wish he could be even more sort of consistent? I do.
Another question here. If I defame you and your family on Twitter or Facebook and spread terrible lies about you, what should the platform do, and what should the government require?
Well, I think the answer to that is, if you defame me, I should sue you. The reason the companies need the protection of 230 is they can't be expected, given the volume of posts and and videos and everything else that's on there, to individually adjudicate the complaints, right? So you say your dog ate my cat. Oh God, I don't know where that jumped into my mind from. And I say it's not true. Facebook can't send an investigator out, and so it's in everybody's. I think it's sort of in everybody's interest to let that post stay up. And if I really think that you harmed me and this is not true, I can go to court and sue you. But in general, I don't think we want the platforms in the business of regulating that kind of speech.
I think this is a question for you. Can you please discuss how the Supreme Court ruling on Murphy versus Missouri and how your case may help challenge this decision?
Yeah, so the Murphy decision was a decision by the court at the end of this past term. It turned on standing, which is the prerequisite for any plaintiff to be able to bring a case in federal court. You have to have standing. It was not a ruling on the merits. And there are a couple things that I would point out about that ruling. The first is, if you look at the plaintiffs and the censorship injuries that were described below at the district court level, at the Fifth Circuit, what the Supreme Court pointed to, the injuries are much more speculative, conjectural. There was no evidence in the record in that litigation of the White House specifically targeting any of those users, much less specific targeting happening and then subsequent censorship happening. And that's what happened in Alex's case. Initial outreach in April of 2021 by the White House nudging him onto Twitter's radar, Twitter, then the old management team imposing sanctions on his account. And as we've alleged in the amended complaint, you actually have Twitter itself internally referring to the two private defendants or proto-private defendants in combination with the White House, which is really extraordinary when you start to look at the evidence that we attached to the first amended complaint. That's how Twitter viewed these actors. The second point that I would raise is that the case in the Murphy case, it was decided on an appeal from a preliminary injunction, and those plaintiffs actually had the benefit of what the court called extensive discovery below. And we're at a completely different stage of this litigation. There's been no discovery taken at this point in the case, so it's a different bar for plaintiffs to demonstrate standing at the preliminary injunction stage versus where we are, which is the initial Rule 12 motion to dismiss stage. So that's my answer.
I would say we think, and again, independent observers think that my case is a lot stronger. I mean, I think you can argue both sides of Murthy, or Missouri v. Biden, and how strong that case is. If my case is dismissed, if we can't win, then really, basically any censorship short of, ordering people to remove posts and users, or ordering companies to remove posts and users at the risk of being shut down, with, explicit threats will be viewed as okay, because what I have, falls really just short of that. And what we already have, without discovery, without talking to the people who are involved. So again, on my Substack, which is this newsletter platform, which I was sort of forced onto when Twitter banned me. And it's a good place, but it doesn't have anything like the outreach of or worldwide reach of Twitter. I describe my case as the edge case, because I really do think it is the edge case. And so, I mean, if the behavior that we've already shown, not speculated, shown, is okay, then then really, again, the White House is going to be able to do anything short of saying, yeah, we'll shut you down if you don't take this guy off.
Here's another question from the audience. Without an attorney, that's my mic, I don't know. Anyway, without an attorney like Mr. Lawrence, how does a person get Twitter to restore my account? I was kicked off in January of 21 on a Saturday and still upset about it.
I think there actually is a process now that Elon Musk owns the company where you can appeal to have your account reinstated. So I would recommend that person search that out on the X website and follow the process and the procedures. It should result in your account getting restored.
If it were another company, the answer would be good luck. Like, there's essentially no chance, because the companies, have taken the position and been backed by the courts that they can do what they want.
Right. And just to build on that, so before his case, again, it's the first known litigation-induced reinstatement of a social media user that we're aware of. And there was an empirical study that was done on these deplatforming cases that found that I think the record of plaintiffs in a position of like Alex's was 0-62. I mean, so yeah, we're talking about even worse than the Chicago White Sox. So if you're
no, really, it's the Harlem Globetrotters and the Washington General. I mean, really,
This one, I'm not sure I can pronounce the name right. Alex, what do you know about Ralph Barrick and his work here at USC?
Oh yes, people have told me today, since I'm down there, I should go knock on the door of the Barrick lab. So this was something. Look, again, I think we could argue about the vaccines and how well they worked or didn't work, but on the issue of lockdowns and school closures, the skeptics were clearly correct. And on the issue of where COVID came from, I mean, look, there are still some people out there in the virology community who won't admit the truth, but everybody knows that it leaked from that lab in Wuhan, and Ralph Barrick was intimately involved with the lab, okay? And he was working with Xi Zhenli, the Bat woman, as the Chinese call her. No joke. And I think, would it have happened anyway? I mean, look, I don't want to say that Barrick caused this. He didn't cause it, and he was clearly concerned about the quality of the research that the Chinese were doing and the protections that they were using. But it didn't stop him from continuing to work with them and sort of help them create what are called chimeric viruses, which are, I mean, here's what happened, okay? SARS, the original SARS happened in 2003, and then something called MERS happened in 2012. A lot of people are not aware of MERS, but MERS was a another coronavirus with a very high lethality rate, very hard to transmit, but very dangerous to people when they did catch it. And this created interest in the virology community in coronaviruses. And respiratory viruses, are very hard to vaccinate against. We don't have a very good vaccine for the flu. We don't have RSV, the new vaccines, they're okay. But we didn't have any decent vaccines for the coronavirus. And so there was this idea of, we're gonna figure out how to build vaccines for the coronavirus. And to do that, we basically need to make the virus more dangerous so that we can figure out how to vaccinate against it. Which turns out to be every bit as stupid as an idea as it sounds. And Ralph Baric was very involved in this. Ralph Baric loves coronaviruses. He's the world's leading expert on coronaviruses right here in Chapel Hill. And is very, very good at working with them and very good at sort of binding different coronaviruses together. Coronaviruses, they're not just in bats, they're in mice and other mammals, and the different coronaviruses have different characteristics, and if you're really good at manipulating viral RNA, you can put them together, and Ralph Baric is really good at that, and I think he really likes it, and I think he probably thinks he's doing really important work, and unfortunately, was working with the Chinese in a lab that had more coronaviruses than anywhere else in the world, and was proposing experiments that, had they been carried out and had a virus leaked, it would have looked exactly like SARS-CoV-2, and yet we're supposed to believe that that's not what happened. As Jon Stewart famously said in either 2021 or 2022, if there were a giant chocolate leak in Hershey, Pennsylvania, you'd know it came from the factory. Okay? It's not a coincidence that the world's leading research on coronaviruses was happening in Wuhan. Okay, it's just not. And this is, when scientists, you can read these, because I subscribe to the New England Journal of Medicine, and I get Science and Nature, and there are all these puzzled articles. What has happened to our credibility? Why don't people believe us anymore? Because you've been lying for years now. And people are tired of it. Why don't you just admit that this didn't possibly come from a raccoon dog? Okay? There's no, you really got me started on this now, but so the skeptics were right that school closures were a disaster. They were right that lockdowns were a big mistake. They were right that this 100% leaked from a lab and was the result of virology gone bad. And we can argue about the mRNA. So those are the big issues of COVID in the last 4 years. And you wonder why the media doesn't want to talk about any of this and wants it all to be forgotten. Because, there were a few of us jerks out there who wouldn't listen to, what our betters were telling us and were complaining on Twitter. And it turned out that the contrarians were basically right about all of it. It's pretty unbelievable, actually.
Let's see, this may be an inquiry and maybe some advice. Would it be possible for you, Alex, to call into radio stations from a better quality phone? What do you have to say is so important and unfortunate, but it is often, unfortunately, it's often a struggle to understand what you're saying.
I will note it. I'll pull over. There was one interview with Clay and Buck where the kids were yelling in the background. That one must have been very special for people.
Next question, let's see. Do we have an obligation to promote free speech and oppose censorship abroad? And if so, to what extent?
I think Hillary Clinton said that we did at some point in 2011, but that was going to be part of America's foreign policy. I think Senator Vance has even made some suggestions that if the United States is going to continue to fund NATO, that the EU might need to rethink its posture towards acts. If you remember, there was a and not just X, but just the general issues of social media censorship. If you recall, I think just recently there was a letter from a European commissioner threatening action against X related to the space that was going to be hosted with President Trump and Elon. They were concerned about some of the things that would be aired there. So, yeah, I think it's an interesting issue, and it's being taken up right now.
I mean, if you look back to the Cold War, right, the United States, pushed speech on the Eastern Bloc and on the Soviet Union, and I think we viewed that as an obligation. Now, I mean, maybe it's more complicated now in terms of what we want to promote, but at the very least, we should stop trying. We should stick to our own principles in the United States. I think that would be a very good place to start.
So, Alex, before you went to the New York Times, you worked, you worked in?
I was at the Denver Post for a few years and something called TheStreet.com, which is still around, which was an online financial.
So, when you went to work for the New York Times, I believe their hiring process was to hire the very best reporters at regional newspapers around the country, whether the Denver Post or the Dallas Morning News or the Des Moines Register. I know in 2019, their hiring process was to hire people from BuzzFeed and other entities like that. And I even asked the publisher at the time, why did you change? Why do you do that? Why are you hiring these people from, he said, well, we're looking for people with digital skills. And so it occurred to me there was a real kind of shift in the way the New York Times was thinking about who they wanted in their newsroom, and maybe they didn't have the understanding of journalistic principles that you had and others that had the benefit of working at regional papers prior to that.
I think that's true, and I think I think it's been. I mean, look, I don't think I could possibly work at the New York Times now, and it's funny sometimes when I write things that people on the right don't like. They're like, "You want to get back to the New York Times?" I'm like, that ship was not just sailed; it was like fired into the sun about 5 years ago. So that's not happening, and that's not what I'm trying to do. I'm just trying to write what I think is right, and sometimes I'm going to be wrong, but I got to do it to the best of my ability. But yes, you're right, and I think for the older generation, people, let's say 45 and up, they're still older journalists at the Times. It's been painful, and one of the worst things that happened to journalism in the last 10 years was the firing or the forced resignation, I don't know what you call it, of a guy named James Bennett. James Bennett was a very good journalist who'd been a Times lifer and then went to the Atlantic, where he ran the Atlantic. So, I mean, really an establishment figure, who then went back to the Times as the editorial page editor, and was viewed as somebody who was very likely to be the next editor of the paper, and was fired for publishing an op-ed by a United States Senator, right? By Tom Cotton wrote about the Floyd protests / riots, and that maybe there would be a need for some kind of military response. I don't want to get it wrong, but I believe that's pretty much what he wrote. And journalists at the Times, African American journalists in particular, said that they believed that op-ed had put their lives at risk, and 72 hours later, James Bennett had been forced to resign, which is a pretty unbelievable turn of events. And what it said to everybody, and that was sort of peak woke, 2020, 2021, peak woke. But what it said to everybody was, it doesn't matter what your credentials are. If you get sideways here, you can lose your job and your career, and it can happen very, very fast. And journalists at the Times, and I think everywhere, took note of that. I mean, the one good thing that I have is that I'm untouchable. I was already canceled, but they couldn't actually shut me up. So I can go on, and I have this Substack, and I have a Twitter following of 500,000 people, and I have this Substack which has 250,000 readers, and most of those people read it for free, but enough people pay that I can pay my mortgage, and everything is sort of okay financially, and I'm not cancelable, but but I'm very fortunate. Most journalists, even really good ones, are not in that position. And that, and what happened to James, was a warning. And a lot of people at the times, older people, took note of it.
I think one of the greatest historical figures on free speech was John Stuart Mill. And in 1859, he published On Liberty. And one of the things he argued in there is that we all need a diversity of opinions that we don't agree with, because it can help us understand our positions better. We might see some fallacy in our opinion, or it may better confirm our understanding of our opinions. So, when I think there were like 800 journalists at the New York Times that opposed the Tom Cotton piece because they didn't like the diversity of opinion. So it makes me wonder if a lot of these journalists had never read anything about John Stuart Mill or know anything about it, but they knew about digital skills. I really don't.
I mean, the worst part is that the more insular they get, the more an outside opinion is a painful shock to them, I think.
Another question from the audience. I think we're about out of time, but they've gotten through most of them. Who is the judge of misinformation?
Everybody gets to be the judge, right? Isn't that how it's supposed to be?
We're supposed to stop at 7:30. I asked for some guidance, but I think I've got one more. Do I have the right to not approve post in a Facebook group if I do not believe it to be helpful to the mission of the group? I state that not all posts will be approved.
So, I mean, that's you as an individual, right? You running your own, whether it's a group or whether it's a small, website. Yes, you do. And one of the things, the sort of the straw man argument that Twitter or Facebook will make is, well, a church group would have to, let, atheists take over its website. Well, no, you can make reasonable distinctions between the biggest carriers and platforms, and an individual who's got a little private group or a small company or a bulletin board. And so, again, there are cases where it's a little more complicated, like a Yelp or review sites and stuff. But the big platform, I mean, we're talking about a handful of companies that have immense power.
Yeah, and just to follow up on that, I tweeted this out, I think at the end of 2021. But when you think about these platforms, I mean, if they want to ban content that would cause anybody to have hesitation to take the COVID-19 vaccine, okay, fine. If you want to promulgate that speech code, or you want to ban people from criticizing the consensus on climate change, or you want to prevent people from discussing election-related issues, election integrity, or voting issues, fine. You can promulgate that speech code. But what the platforms are doing, I maintain, is a bait and switch. They call themselves the free speech wing of the free speech party. They say we're a global public square. They promulgate codes of conduct and yet take punitive action against users like Alex who say things that don't even violate their own policies, and then sit back and say, Section 230 applies, we can't be held accountable, and oh, look at the fine print here, any or no reason, get out of here, you don't have a claim. And the point that I made on Twitter was, you could not run a lemonade stand like this and not face constant litigation, lawsuits, and legal scrutiny if you were operating any kind of other business. But big tech has the benefit of Section 230 and very powerful legal precedents to shield that kind of accountability, unfortunately, from my vantage point.
Anyway, thank you for the questions, and thank you all for coming, and wish us luck.